joining us now on the Boardwalk on the Hotline, a man who knows a lot about the Philadelphia Eagles. He covered them for many, many years. He knows this organization. He knows the people who are involved. And you can check out his Extra Points articles at 973ESPN.com. He is Dave Weinberg. Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, guys. How are you?
Doing good. So, I think one of the biggest things I want to ask you first and foremost before we get to any specific players or any specific picks is, what was your perception of the Eagles coming into this draft, considering the fact that we know that, you have a new offensive coaches in the building, no more Joe Douglas, it's Andy Weidel, who's now the Joe Douglas in the organization now. There's some different variables from last year to this year when it comes to draft day. And, of course, the pandemic and the lockdown the world is in. So I want to know, what was your perspective on the Eagles coming into the draft?
I was really curious to see how everything was going to unfold as far as the power structure. Like you mentioned, Joe Douglas was there for a couple of years and pretty much supervised everything for Howie. And now it seems like I guess Andy Weidel's had a big influence on it, but the dynamic has really changed as with the rest of the league. I mean, scouts were pulled off of the road, weren't allowed to go to a whole lot of the pro days. Individual interviews were really limited, so they were kind of going by what they saw on tape and at the combine as far as picking players. But yeah, this is Howie Roseman's draft, and how these picks turn out is going to go a long way to determining his legacy, I think.
You mentioned the fact that a lot of this is dependent on more tape than other elements that go usually into the draft process. Do you think, just an overall perspective, how can that help or hurt an organization in terms of evaluating guys? Because sometimes, over-analysis can be paralysis, right? But sometimes as well, you need those meetings to really get some clarity on certain guys.
Oh, it's very true. Yeah, those are good points. I think that this guy, I've always been a believer that if you want to see a football player, if you want to see if he can play or not, then you just turn on his tape and you watch him play football. The tendency is, I think sometimes teams get too enamored with the intangibles as far as 40-yard times and vertical leap and shuttle runs and that kind of thing. But, I guess they've probably realized now that, players go down to Florida, go out to California, Arizona, or whatever, and train specifically for those drills at the combine and individual workouts. So you're really not getting a sense, I don't think, of whether the kid can really play football or not. And the only way you can see that, I think, is to watch him play. So I'm hoping that maybe this is kind of like a return back to basics a little bit. Like you're watching to see if the kid can really do what you want him to do on the football field, and ultimately that's the most important thing. I think the downside, though, is that the one-on-one contact that you want to have with a player, you want to get a sense of his personality, of his how he's going to fit into your locker room culture, and some guys they even get coached up on that kind of thing as far as interviews goes. But I think the more time you spend with a guy, the more sense you can get as to what he's like as a person, in addition to just being a player. And that's the thing that's lacking in the draft process this year.
By the way, Dave, per your tweet, another quarterback has been removed from the potential quarterback factory as the Jets just drafted James Morgan. So another quarterback's off the board.
There you go, guys. One less worker on the factory line, huh?
We can't avoid it, though. I mean, everyone out there, either they're losing their mind over Jalen Hurts, or they're really trying hard to rationalize it. Dave, do you genuinely believe, as someone who covered the NFL for all the years that you did, you've been in those press rooms with people like Doug Peterson and all these guys, are we genuinely to believe that they drafted Jalen Hurts because they think he's this new element being added to an offense and that he can be their Taysom Hill? Is that really a legitimate thing that we should understand and believe?
I don't, but I think that if you want to rationalize it, that's the only way you can. He's some sort of Taysom Hill kind of guy that you can plug in with Drew Brees and be that kind of that wild card, if you will. But I don't think that you don't spend a second round pick on somebody like that. You don't you don't do that with a guy that you may be like a so-called gimmick player. In the second round, as far as the Eagles are concerned, they need players who can make immediate impacts. And to draft a quarterback and that position was just, I was absolutely stunned when they did that.
Do you think there's a possibility that this pick may have been pushed on Howie by people like Doug Peterson and Press Taylor?
Honestly, I think it's the opposite. I think Howie kind of pushed it on them. I just don't see where Doug would just by his mannerisms, the way he's conducting himself all through the post, when they have the Zoom meetings after the draft to catch everybody up. It just is. His body language tells me that I don't know if he's necessarily behind all these moves. And I think Howie, he's got a really big ego, and he wants everybody to know that he's the smartest person in the room. And I think this is one of those picks where I think it was an opportunity for him to go outside the box and show everybody that, yeah, he's the guy calling the shots, and I don't care what anybody else thinks, and this is how it's going to be.
How much influence do you think that people like Doug Peterson, Andy Weidel, any specific scout ever has on a person like Howie Roseman? Because we know that every organization handles the power structure differently. So how much influence do you think certain people in the organization have in these kind of decisions?
Oh boy, you would think that Doug would have he would have earned the right to have that cachet, that he would be the one that would have the ultimate say. But I don't know that that's the case, as you saw last night with Jalen Hurts. I have a really hard time believing that was Doug's call. Years before, you knew that Andy Reid had a very strong influence as far as who they were drafting. Even when Joe Banner and those guys were there, Chip Kelly asserted himself, forced them to give him more power. You saw what a disaster that was. And I would think that, after you win a Super Bowl, the only Super Bowl the team has ever won, you would think that would grant Doug and Jim Schwartz, for that matter, that they would have a strong voice in this draft process. But I'm not really sure that they do.
Dave Weinberg joining us on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure to check out his extra points columns at 97.3ESPN.com. A lot of great insights you bring out there, Dave, on the website. I always enjoy reading them because, as I said, you're someone who is around all these people for so long. So I feel like sometimes it gets overlooked, the fact that, sometimes the people who are making some of the analysis, no offense to anybody on TV, I understand, it's their job and their livelihood. But listen, no offense to the Mel Kipers of the world, but they've probably never had more than 2-word conversation ever with Doug Peterson in their life. So I think there's a huge difference between the draft analyst and the guy who actually has been in the room with these people. So that's why I say that, because I feel like what you can bring to us, Dave, is the fact that, listen, you cover this organization in its multiple forms, from before Andy Reid, the Chip Kelly, the Doug Peterson. I think that kind of context kind of allows us to understand a little bit more of what is really going on with these people. Because let's be realistic, Dave, the majority of the fans, they don't really have all the facts, because of the fact that a lot of times these NFL teams are very tight-lipped about what is really going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, they are, and I guess they kind of have to be. They have to keep things, close to the vest. And I have all the respect in the world for the Mel Kipers of the world, that they've found their niche. They can tell you about a guy from some Division III school in Tennessee that nobody's ever heard of, I think there's an avenue for that. Like, the draft has evolved over the years into this national primetime event, and that wasn't always the case. And I think fans they really get behind those guys that and trust what they have to say. And I do too, to a point. I mean, I admit that I don't really know a whole lot about who they're going to take in the 7th round necessarily. From a guy that I don't really spend a whole lot of time investigating those late round picks like those guys do. And that they've created, like I said, quite a niche for themselves, and more power to them. I rely on them as well. But yeah, I'm more in tune to, or try to be more in tune to, what the teams are thinking. What they might be leaning towards. But to be fair, I mean, a lot of those guys, the general managers and the coaches, they're only telling you what they want you to tell, what they want to tell you, what they want you to hear. So, sometimes it's difficult to kind of read between the lines at some point. And, that was certainly the case last night. Like I said, I don't think anybody, no one thought that they were drafting a quarterback with the 53rd overall pick.
Well, Dave, we timed this perfectly because the Eagles' next pick just came in. Here is the pick. The Eagles have drafted Clemson safety Kavon Wallace, the two-time ACC defensive all-team. So it looks like, Dave, they've actually addressed a specific need with this pick.
That's great. Yeah, they definitely need a safety that, after losing Malcolm Jenkins, they needed somebody that's going to, I don't think you can necessarily expect Jalen Mills to make that smooth transition from corner to safety with Rodney McLeod. Signed a couple guys that, might be able to contribute, but they needed a young, promising guy that they can plug in there, and hopefully he'll grow with Rodney, become a stabilizing influence in that defense, and hopefully the guy maybe he learned a little bit from Brian Dawkins from his Clemson days, although he probably doesn't even know who Brian Dawkins is. But yeah, they've done a pretty good job, I think, overall in the draft. They got the wide receiver, the Jalen Reagor, that everybody. Not necessarily him, but they definitely needed a wide receiver with their first pick. I'm expecting them to maybe draft at least one or two more. And safety was another position where they didn't really address that a whole lot in free agency like they did some of the other parts of the defense. So it's good that they picked the safety here because that definitely fills one of their needs.
By the way, according to some of the projections with Wallace, he's another one of these guys who can play safety, corner, nickel linebacker. So it feels like, Dave, now with you sign Will Parks, you can do a lot of different things. Jalen Mills, they've already called him a hybrid, which who really knows what that really means. And then Wallace, it feels like now you have three different guys who can be versatilely used as different pieces in whatever defensive formation.
Same thing with Davion Taylor, the guy they picked last night from Colorado. He's kind of like that hybrid, played safety for Colorado. Now they're viewing him more as an outside linebacker, I guess, kind of like they did with Nate Gary, who was a safety in college as well. So yeah, Jim Schwartz likes those guys that he can move around, that he can find formations of things that play to their strengths. He likes those so-called hybrid guys that aren't necessarily married to just one position. It's even with defensive linemen. You've seen it with Brandon Graham, where he likes to move him inside and outside. Malcolm Jenkins, when he was here, did a lot of blitzing and started his NFL career as a corner with the Saints. So yeah, the more versatile guys you can get, the better off you are as a defense.
Yeah, and the thing with Davion Taylor, and I've heard a couple people mention the Nate Gary comparison. I know that makes some Eagle fans cringe, but to me, Dave, the big difference between Taylor and Gary is that Taylor is much more of a freak athlete than Gary is, because this is a guy who had over 20 bench press reps at the combine. He was one of the fastest linebackers at the combine. He's a guy who was a track and field athlete in JUCO before he got to Colorado. So, I think to me, at least, the difference between Taylor and Gary is that, you may have a similar type of player, but you're getting a better version of that player in Taylor.
Yeah, you're probably right there. He is a freakish athlete, like you said. The only thing that would possibly give me pause is the fact that doesn't have a whole lot of experience as a football player. The fact that he didn't play in high school due to religious beliefs, so he doesn't have that 4 years of the Friday Night Lights that a lot of guys have. But he's more than made up ground for that. He's a player that the Eagles are pretty excited about, and I'm not as down on Nick Gary as some of the other people. If you notice, he seems to, his tackling probably isn't the best, but he seems to have that nose for the football. That whenever you need a key pass breakup or even an interception, he's frequently the guy who comes up with it. He's not a flashy player. He's not, like you said, a freakish athlete, but I think he's a pretty heady football player, a smart guy who really knows how to play the game, and there's a place for those guys in the league also.
Hey, Dave, if I could backtrack to something you said just a couple minutes ago. You mentioned about the Eagles' defensive line and Brandon Graham. You now have, it looks like it's going to be three really high-quality defensive tackles. You obviously have Fletcher Cox. You have Malik Jackson coming off the injury, and now you have Hargrave you signed. How do you envision them using all of these defensive linemen? Because one of the questions was last year, well, who are the ends? Who's going to be the pass rushers on the end? And it seems like the Eagles are just beefing up the middle more and more. To you, what does that signify?
Well, I think that Jim Schwartz has always been the type of guy who I think the more people you can have in the trenches, the better off you are. He likes to rotate guys in and out, and you're right. Those are three stud defensive tackles that you can plug in, rotate. I would assume Fletcher Cox gets the bulk of the snaps, being one of the best in the league. But there's also room for those other two guys. As far as the outside, I'm not really sure what they're planning. I mean, I guess the fact you still have Brandon Graham, and I guess they're counting on Barnett coming back healthy and focused. And there's a couple other guys waiting in the wings like Josh Sweat and those kind of guys. So I was kind of expecting them to draft an edge rusher as well, and maybe they still will. But it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the front four. Like you said, they have a lot of movable parts, but I guess it's going to be up to Jim to figure out how they all best fit, and that's a real challenge this year, like you said, because of the fact that they're not practicing right now. That's going to put even more pressure with both with Doug and with Jim to get things together when the time comes.
Yeah, speaking of not practicing, Sean Payton about a month ago in an interview brought up the fact that he remembers back in 2011 how when they had the lockout, they had no OTAs, no minicamp. It was just like you show up in training camp basically the first week of August and you had to hit the ground running. And he made an interesting point. He believes the teams that have established head coaches and front offices, they are going to have an advantage over the other teams that don't, because he says that the organizational structure will already be in place. So if you think about the Eagles, they're the only team in the NFC that has the same head coach and GM coming back, the tandem, into this season. So do the Eagles potentially have a real hand up on the Cowboys, the Giants, and the Redskins going into the season?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. There's a lot to be said for stability, and like you said, they don't have to teach everyone their system. The guys that are coming back already know it, so they can so to speak hit the ground running. And there's everybody knows what Doug Peterson's offense is. Everybody knows what Jim Schwartz's defense is. And they don't have to spend the extra time learning those systems and getting comfortable with their teammates and that kind of stuff, because they've already been there. It's going to be a challenge obviously for the new guys coming in, but even some of those guys like Darius Slay, they played under Jim Schwartz before, so they kind of know what to expect and what's going to be expected of them. So it's going to be a much more smoother transition for the Eagles than it will be for the rest of the NFC East. You're right there.
All right, Dave, before I let you go, I got to know, everyone has their opinion. What has been your thought about the presentation of this virtual draft? Is it a thumbs up for you, a thumbs down? Are there some things you like, some things you can't stand? And what has your perception been of the presentation of this whole thing?
I think they've done a pretty good job given the circumstances. I was getting a little sick of seeing Roger Goodell, and I think he was getting a little tired of being on TV also. I mean, it got to the point where he was just like slouching in his lounge chair, reading off the picks off the top of his head. But I thought they kind of met the challenge pretty well. I would have liked to have seen more interviews with players, which you're not getting. And when you have it live, like everybody saw in Philly a couple of years ago, I mean, just to have that fan presence, that adds an extra element of excitement and and drama to the event that's not there this year. But I mean, given what all that they've had to deal with, I've been pleasantly surprised with the way they've been able to deliver the product, honestly.
Well, they've had over 16 million people watching each night, so for whatever it's worth, you have a lot of people watching, Dave. Maybe even more than they've broken every record in terms of linear television watching, with this being on.
Again, so there's nothing else to watch either, so that kind of helps
true.
Too, I think.
Although I do find it's funny that there's a lot of people who maybe don't really watch the draft, and their big thing is they love watching the people's houses. Like Cliff Kingsbury looks like he stole Hugh Hefner's house or something with that bachelor pad with the incense burning in the yard and stuff. It was ridiculous. But hey, listen, it's a little something for everybody, right?
Yeah, there you go. Yep, different strokes for different folks.
Right, exactly. All right, Dave Weinberg's been with us here on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure you follow Dave on Twitter at DaveWeinberg19 and check out all of his extra point articles at 97.3ESPN.com. Dave, appreciate you jumping on Saturday.
Oh, anytime. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.